Michael, and thank you very much for inviting me here. It's a great honour, not least because I'm following some of my very illustrious colleagues in giving this lecture. And I know that when they came over, they were very notable for giving you inspiring talks. I hope that I can, in some way, emulate them. I've been in the field of mental health and employment for 25 years now, nearly 26 years really. And for the first half of that time I ran, well indeed I started an organisation in England, very like ITO in some ways. Certainly the kind of services, the kind of origin was the same. We started at a point where the big mental hospitals were closing and we were moving their work programmes out into the community. And I'm going to talk about that journey a little bit, because what I want you to know really is that what I'm saying doesn't just come from reading research papers, but actually from hard, sometimes bitter experience, from taking a very good, strong look at what we were actually achieving, and through making mistakes. And I sometimes said that the first half of my time as a service provider was setting up services and the other half was closing them down. I didn't actually manage to close down all my mistakes by the time I ended. I left that for others to do. But I think by the time I did move into this kind of field, I think we knew a little bit more about what we needed to be doing. And it's that I'm going to be talking about. And can I just be very clear, what I'm talking about here is getting paid employment, competitive employment, for people with severe and enduring mental health problems, people with diagnosis of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, severe and recurring depression, people in touch with secondary mental health services. I'm going to start by talking a bit about the research evidence. I hope it won't be too dry. Your chair has pointed out one or two graphs there, but I will intend to elucidate them. I then want to just say a couple of words about how this evidence has or has not permeated into policy, certainly over the water. But then I want to talk perhaps most importantly about the ways in which the evidence is beginning to come into practice in England and in parts of England. Not an easy process, one that is, I think if you have to say, well, actually an academic said to me the other day, he said, once I thought that I'd just do a study, test out the proposition, write a paper and everyone would do it, and they don't. And it's what you do once you know what to do that I should be devoting the last bit of my lecture to. My first slide really only repeats what Michael said. In the UK, less than 20% of people with serious and severe and enduring mental health problems are in employment. If you look at diagnoses such as schizophrenia, it's much lower. They are the lowest employment rates and the highest want-to-work rates of any disabled group. This came out of the Perkins review recently. And as Michael says, work is good for health, and I'll be developing that a little bit later because there's some good research evidence there too. And unemployment is very damaging. But I think this comment, if you think work is bad for people with mental health problems, try poverty, unemployment and social isolation, really does encapsulate the problem. And there is good evidence, as Michael says, to suggest that we can dramatically improve the rates of getting people into paid work for those who want. And I do want to stress also that getting people into work is something they have to want to do. I'm not one for driving people into work. None of the evidence supports this. So we may have some questions about that later, but actually what we're talking about is people who have an aspiration to work, which actually is most people in touch with secondary service. They may feel quite afraid and taking the step. It might feel it's a very risky thing to do. But most people, either now or as an aspiration, they see work, employment as part of their recovery, part of their ability to lead the kind of lives they want to lead. More than half of the people going into programs should be able to get paid work, at least. At the moment, well, I don't know what your statistics are like over here, but when I ran services, then we weren't achieving anything like those rates of employment for people, even in our best vocational rehabilitation services, shelter work services. And I'm going to just give you a little bit of history there. I mean, you're very much familiar with it, the closure of the large hospitals, the moves into the community. the first of the big, really big long-stay hospitals, Banstead, closed in 1985 in England, the first of the Epsom cluster to do so. And I was charged with taking what was called BioRoom, which was Banstead Industrial Rehabilitation Unit, into its new life. And I have to say that I really regret what I did, which was very good intentioned at the time. I thought it was a very good thing to do. I thought that if we took what was a very productive, nice unit, but actually in a large decaying mental hospital that people would bust into every day, and we took that and we put it in an industrial setting where everyone else was working, where it was a real normal work environment, then not only could we improve the productivity and the general feeling of normality, but we'd also, by some process of osmosis, help people get into work, into paid competitive work. And of course it was a complete failure in that respect. It wasn't a failure in other respects. People liked it very much, actually. They stayed there for years and years and years. But actually the same rate of getting into work, about 5%, about 1 in 20 was all we ever achieved, and that's what Banstead did as well. And interestingly, the people who did get work were often those who said, sorry, I'm going to get a job, and who refused to comply with what was going on within the unit. This approach I have characterised, and others too, as train then place. Basically, it's an obstacle course. You wait until clinicians think that someone is sufficiently okay to consider them being employable. Then you prepare them, sometimes at huge length, by doing various kind of largely pre-vocational activities. I say this because sometimes we call them vocational training activities, and often they're not at all. Certainly the ones we used to do were sort of job-like, but they actually were not to industry standard. You know, you get your certificate, but you're still nowhere near the level of certificate that you would need to get a job. And so actually what you were doing was prolonging the process. And then of course you had the work readiness assessments to see if people on the whole thought people were ready to try for work. And of course by that time, hope, confidence, belief had drained away. And sometimes people went into work and lost it immediately afterwards. Very often they just didn't complete the hurdle course. And what it really revealed to me, I think, above all, was that we were approaching it in an entirely wrong way. Somehow, people who really wanted to work, really wanted a job, we were letting down, and we were giving them the wrong message. What we were saying by offering this hurdle course was actually not, yes, we think you are able to get a job, yes, we will get you a job. What we were saying was, no, actually, we're not at all sure whether we can get you a job. We're not at all sure you're employable. And of course, this can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think that's really where we're at. One of the things, because I know you've been thinking about recovery as a way and a philosophy of developing services. And if you know the kind of dimensions of recovery, the most important one really is hope. Hope of a better life. And if you kill that, then people do not recover. And I think that's really what we were doing in these places. Having said which, as I say, people liked them. The people particularly who'd spent years in Banstead liked them very much. But one we also found was that the population was getting older and older, and the new people, the younger people who first episode psychosis, people who'd just come into the system, just didn't want to know. So actually the numbers started to go wrong as well. So what did we do? Well, thanks indeed to some European programs, we started to experiment with something which I've now characterised as place and train. Developed largely from the experience of people in the learning disability field, the job coach model, which has many sensible points about it, particularly the bit about getting people into work and supporting them intensively while there, working with them to ensure that they can do the job in a real setting, not preparing them for years and years and then hoping they're going to make it somehow in a different setting, but actually working alongside them in a real job placement. And I set up a number of supported employment agencies, but The results were okay. They were a bit better than we were getting in sheltered work, certainly, even the best sheltered workshops, because the Banstead one wasn't typical. We had much better ones than that, actually. But basically, it was still, 20, 30%, 20, 25%. And because we didn't know what we were doing, we just made it up as we went along. Where there were, every one of the services I set up did things differently, and we tried to kind of learn together how to do it. But actually, when it boiled down to it, really, I think only one of the services that I set up at that point really approximated to what we now know as individual placement and support. The approach from the United States that led towards the codification of individual placement and support wasn't a sudden revelation. It was a slow process of building up from the lessons of supported employment. What do you do? What works? How do you actually create a set of principles on which you can base a service? And once they'd done that, the researchers in Dartmouth Medical College and others, you would be familiar with the names, those of you in the field, Bob Drake, Debbie Becker, Gary Bonds, started to do not just evaluations, do people like it or not, but actual randomised control trials, high quality research with a control group, so that you could know that if you were getting higher results than the control group, you knew that the intervention that you were piloting worked. That's what control groups are about. And gradually they refined the methodology and published the results in academic journals. And a very strong evidence base was developed, and I'll show you that in a minute. But actually, when you look at what the evidence is for effective interventions for this group of people, probably the evidence for supported employment is stronger than any of the others. Stronger than drug treatment, stronger than case management, stronger than psychological therapy. Actually, this works. And so we started to try and implement this. Now, simultaneously to my having discovered this, Rachel Perkins, who did one of these lectures a while ago, went over to the States and actually saw what was going on there, and came back very evangelical about it, and I was one of the people she evangelised. And we've worked together ever since on this. She did better than me because she set up a service in southwest London that has been going now for 12, 13 years and publishes its results every year. And I should be talking about some of those results in a minute because they're really quite impressive. But it hasn't really caught on elsewhere. I'll tell you the extent to which it's caught on that I know about, which is that we have been running a programme for a year and a bit now, looking at what we call centres of excellence, services that aspire to deliver evidence-based supported employment. And we've come across a further 8 services across the country, big mental health trust, big mental health organisation. But it's very thin on the ground, which shows how difficult it is, even when you've got a really good evidence base, how difficult it is to get it into practice and into policy. So what is this? Well, it's very common sense, really. There are 7 evidence-based principles. And they all look pretty sensible on the face of it, and they all look pretty easy to apply. Actually, they are very sensible, and they're not all very easy to apply. First, eligibility is based on individual choice, no exclusions. This means that you don't spend time assessing whether someone is ready for work. Basically, as Bob Drake says, really, we know, and we know from research evidence, that actually people's judgment on who is employable and who is not is very poor. Diagnosis, symptoms when at their worst, even record of hospitalisation is a poor indicator of employability, are poor indicator. Social skills when out of work, very poor indicator of employability. Actually, the best indicator is someone really, really wants to work. And so when Bob Drake was asked the question at a lecture he gave for us a while ago, who do you allow into your programs? He said, anyone who holds their hand up. That's the point. That's where you catch the moment of hope, the moment of self-belief, and that is what is to be nurtured. So, don't waste time assessing your view of people's employability. If they want to work, then take them in the program.